Our text today is from the book of Luke, chapter 16. It's a parable that Jesus tells his disciples. At the end of this parable, it talks about how one cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. And so many a time this passage, at least the end of this passage, is used for stewardship Sundays. It's okay because it's not a stewardship sermon that I'm giving today, all right? But I want you to listen carefully to what Jesus tells us in this parable. He tells his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master has taken away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know how to ensure that I'll have plenty of friends who'll give me a home when I'm fired." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. And he asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second one, "How much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be entrusted or dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money." This is God's word for you, God's people. Amen? All right. Well, for some reason, my thing's not working here for me. There we go. Very good. Well, what a different parable that Jesus shares with us. Somewhat, certainly that first part of it's kind of a crazy parable. It almost kind of wonder. I know the first time I read that, it's like, did I read that? Did I read that right? A scoundrel lifted up, and Jesus tells us to be like that. I mean, this is probably one of those texts that you haven't heard preached on too many times, just because of its content. And it's certainly not one of those that you've probably heard in Sunday school class as a child. Be like the scoundrel. Be like this scoundrel. Why in the world would Jesus tell a story that makes a hero out of a thief? I mean, in most of Jesus' parables or stories, the hero is a positive role model, like the Good Samaritan or the father in the story of the prodigal son. But this story applauds a man who is obviously dishonest. What's up with that? But you see, all Scripture is good for preaching and teaching and for the edification of believers, and especially one that comes straight from Jesus' lips. That should certainly we should take special notice, and so we should just maybe see what Jesus has to, what he means by emulating this dirty, rotten scoundrel. You know, speaking of scoundrels, I once heard a story about a young lawyer who was called in to represent this big firm, this large railroad company that was being sued by a farmer. It seems that the farmer's prize cow went missing from the field in which that railroad went through, that train went through, and so this farmer was suing the railroad for the loss of his cow. Now, before it went to trial, the lawyer cornered the farmer and convinced him to settle for half of what he originally wanted. And so the farmer, he signed the necessary paperwork and accepted the check. And this young lawyer, he couldn't resist gloating about his success. And he said to the farmer, he said, I couldn't have won this case. No way could I have won this case if it went to trial. The engineer, he was asleep, and the fireman there in the caboose, he wasn't there that morning. He was missing. I didn't have a leg to stand on. I didn't have a single witness to put on that stand. The farmer kind of looked down and kind of smiled, and he said, "Well, young feller," he said, "I was a little worried about winning that case myself, because that cow came home this morning." And I want you to understand is that both the farmer and this lawyer could have related to this shrewd crook Jesus tells us about in the story. Let me set the scene for you. In Jesus' day, there were many absentee landlords. They would hire a business manager, a steward, to take care of their farm and their financial assets. It was common practice. So the central character in this story is the steward, okay, the manager. Remember that as the Old Testament, it prohibits Jews from loaning money and charging interest to fellow Jews. They could charge interest to non-Jews, but not to Jews. And so the workaround, that comes actually from Deuteronomy 23, the prohibition against usury. It applied to money and commodities. And so the workaround, that creates an opening for a steward, a manager. For the steward managed the farm and its finances. The steward's job was to manage and to sell the commodities from the farm, like the wheat, the corn, olive oil, wine, And he made his money by charging interest. Okay? Now the plot thickens because this steward is taking a bigger share of the profit for himself than his boss knew. But when the annual audit's done, the stealing by the steward, it's obvious. So, in Jesus' story, the boss fires this dishonest steward manager and tells him to go get the books in order for the final accounting. And here is where the shrewdness of the steward comes into play. Now, he knows his goose is cooked. All right, there is no getting out of this. He has been terminated. His final task now is to get the books into the hands of the owner so that the new steward, the new manager, can take over. And so here he is, on his way back to the office. Stewards, or this manager's mind, it's spinning, trying to figure out what he's going to do as he turns those books in. And he thinks to himself, I'm not strong enough to do construction. I'm definitely not strong enough or not going to sit by an interstate and hold a sign up that says we'll work for food. And then comes another idea. He pulls out the file that lists all of the people who owes something to the owner. And he grabs a cell phone and he starts calling them up one by one. And he says, "You owe $1,000. I tell you what, I'll make that $500 if you can get that check to the owner today. You owe $800. Let's settle for $600 right now. Okay? You owe $400, but let's make that $250. And all afternoon, the debtors show up to the corporate office to pay their renegotiated bills to the owner. And the manager all the while thinks to himself, well, at least if I lose my job, I'm going to have some friends out there because I've really cut their bills because now they're indebted to me. Yeah. And one of them may very well give me a job or a place to stay. And then the manager waits for the axe to drop. And you can just about imagine how this owner is going to respond to his shenanigans. That owner, he's going to be out of a whole lot of money because what he did. Probably not going to be too happy with this guy. Should have just had security, escort him right to the doors instead of having to get the books together. But this is where the parable turns. The oddest thing happens. When the owner of the company finds out what the manager is done, he gives him a pat on the back. He gives him a raise. He gives him a promotion. He gives him a week's vacation on the company yacht. Great job, he says. Commending the crooked, embezzling, discount-giving manager. I don't know about you, but I can just about see the gleam in Jesus' eyes whenever he got to the end of this story. His listeners probably had on their faces that same silly look I had on mine the first time I read this story. I know, listening to that parable, it's like, do what? Say what? That's not right. The owner rewards the manager. First he steals from the company, and then he unilaterally, without the owner's permission or consent, discounts the accounts receivable. Why in the world would the owner reward this crook for doing such a thing? Jesus doesn't answer that question. Jesus doesn't answer that question. He just lets us stew. He just lets us stew. Just think about it. So let's hold that question for a moment, okay? About why would the owner reward the crooked manager? I'll get back to it. Now, there are some takeaways from this that we probably should look at. The first, I think Jesus would have us to understand in this story is that we Christians should at least be as shrewd and as far-sighted as non-believers. Now, Jesus is not calling us to be shrewd in the fashion that we might think of the word. I mean, our use of the word carries with it a lot of luggage. In fact, in part of our dictionary definition of being shrewd, it includes the word shy or sly. But the basic definition of the word is sharp, or wise, or perceptive, artful. Okay? And in that meaning of the word, Jesus is affirming shrewdness. On another occasion, you remember Jesus calling us to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. Remember that? It's the same kind of thinking. But in this text, Jesus points us to the truth about being shrewd, about being wise, about being clever. And he says in verse 8 that the people of this world are certainly more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. Listen, being Christian is no excuse for being dumb. I mean, why we Christians, we ought to be at least as good at anticipating the future and planning wisely as anyone. I mean, do you suppose that Walmart has a plan for planting stores in the next 25 years? What do you think? Do they have a pretty good idea of what's going to be happening in the next 25 years? Pretty sure they do, because Walmart plans ahead. Do you suppose that the Indiana Highway Department has already purchased salt and sand for the upcoming winter? You know, it's May. It's only May, but don't you think they've already done that? Well, sure they have. Sure they have. In fact, I once read that they have to plan 2 to 3 years ahead before they make for those orders. Don't you suppose that the Republicans know who they're going to run in 2028? They don't have a clue, folks. Right? Now, totally lost. But you know, I gravitate more toward the Republican Party. But I want to tell you what, the Democrats understood this principle that Jesus is talking about because they were shrewd enough, or wise enough, or clever enough to groom Barack Obama for president back in the day. All right? And they kept him out of the limelight as much as they possibly could and kept him away from all the major issues so that whenever he did run for president, even Indiana voted for him. I don't know what happened to him since then as far as the the Democrat Party. They need to be grooming someone so as the Republicans need to be grooming someone again. But see, what I'm saying is that the world knows how to plan accordingly, and it knows how to anticipate the future. So must the church. So must the church. We, as the children of light, must be just as good at anticipating the future and planning wisely for it. I mean, just look at the average church building built 75, 100, 150 years ago. What were people thinking? You know? Building steps to every level that you need to get to. Do people not realize that people get old and steps are hard to get up and down? I mean, come on. The church has to anticipate the future and plan accordingly. We can't just sit around and wait for something to happen or just fly by the seat of our pants or just expect that someone else is going to fix the problems that we face in the church. We can't just sit around as a congregation and get grayer and then keep having funeral dinner after funeral dinner and think that just somehow one day it's all going to work out. Do you know where Walmart would be if they operated like that? Bankrupt. Of course, they'd probably get a bailout, right? Right. But we don't have that option. One of the reasons we don't have that option is because we're not the only United Methodist congregation dealing with this problem. And as far as that goes, we're not the only church dealing with this problem because Presbyterians, Church of Christ, Baptists, on down the line are all dealing with the same problem because it's a cultural problem. For years we've heard about the great gray tsunami. That's not just coming, folks, but it's here right now. That huge group of people that make up our church and our country, people born before 1964. And so we have to be wise about this, shrewd about this, clever in how we are going to address this in our church and how we have to plan accordingly for not just today, but for our future. We have to evaluate and reevaluate and reassess everything that we do and why we are doing it. And then we have to constantly make the necessary changes that's going to move us into the most effective ministries that we can be about. And this is something that I think, anyways, I know since I've been here, that we've been trying to do. We've been doing that by working on a collective vision together. We've been doing that by restructuring our administrative committees into one unifying council, which streamlines us for the ability to do ministry and to act quickly. We no doubt will have Pastor Sean, when he comes on board here, no doubt he will continue to help you work and plan accordingly to carry out those plans in the future that we put and those new plans that you will put together. And the good news in all of this is that there's hope. Okay, there's hope. We do not have to remain the same number that we are. We do not have to shrink smaller as more heads get gray, I'm talking to the guys now, all right? As more heads get gray, because ladies' hairs don't get gray, right? Right? Okay, all right. But I want to tell you what, if we don't do anything, if we think let somebody else do it, it won't happen. All right? But if we put our heads together as much as we put our hands together, in so many ways that we do, that's great here, and we allow ourselves to be open to some new ways of doing ministry, which I've seen you do this, and so I know you can, and we work in the church together and we reach out, I want to tell you something, there is great possibility for this congregation. There's huge possibility for this congregation. But if we just do what we've been doing in the last 10 years in the same way that we've been doing and expect some kind of a different outcome like church growth or not feeling all wore out or whatever, that's nuts. Einstein's definition of insanity is what? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results? So we as the church must anticipate the future, right? That future that is close to us right now and that future that is further away. And then we have to plan accordingly. Plan wisely. This is central to what Jesus is teaching us here in this parable. Now back to the question that Jesus doesn't answer, but we certainly ask. Why? Why would the owner reward the crooked manager? Why would he do that? Why would he applaud this dishonest steward? I mean, he steals from the company. He gives away the company money by discounting the receivables. What is worth applause here? Well, here's my theory. And it comes in the form of a story. Story about a woman who attended a fundraiser for an organization that serves kids with muscular dystrophy. The place needed a new swimming pool, and so the kids could have water therapy. And you know how expensive indoor swimming pools can be. And by this woman, though, listened to the story about Jerry's kids, and her heart was moved, and she took out her checkbook, she wrote a check, and it was a check for a very large sum. And she felt good about that. She felt great about that. That's how we are to give. It's to feel good to give. And she felt great. Her husband, on the other hand, didn't feel so great about it. All right? When he found out what she'd done, he became extremely angry. One, because she didn't talk it over with him as she should have. And for two, he'd worked a lot of overtime to earn that money, and they'd been saving up for their 25th wedding anniversary. They were going to take a trip to Europe. And so he tells her, he says, get in the car. We're going down there, and you're going to make them give that money back. All right? It wasn't a happy car ride down to the center. And whenever they arrived, the wife spotted the director, and feeling really embarrassed, she told him what had happened. Of course, he was devastated, but he went to his office to retrieve the check. But just as he was handing the check back to this woman, one of those little kids came out. One of Jerry's kids came out, and in a wheelchair. It was being pushed by his mother, and his mother pushed that chair right up to that husband. And there he stands with his hands on his hips, kind of just waiting impatiently for his wife to get back. And that lady with that little boy in the wheelchair says to her son, she says, honey, she says, this is the man who gave all that money to help build the pool. Little boy took the husband's hand and he pressed it against his cheek, and he smiled a crooked little smile, and he says, thank you, thank you. And the husband couldn't help but to say, you're welcome. Then the husband took out his checkbook and wrote even a bigger check. How do you suppose those debtors felt about the man who owned the company that showed them mercy and forgave their debt? I bet they probably thought that he was the most loving and generous man they ever met. And that owner wasn't about to argue with that. Just like that man in the story. You see, when you and I show mercy and kindness and love to others, it reflects upon the owner of the divine enterprise of which we are a part. This modern day parable teaches us as Christians to be as good at anticipating the future and planning wisely as any good business would in which we live. And along with this, we must realize that everything that we do, everything that we fail to do, reflects what we really believe about God, about the owner. In other words, we are a walking testament. So use what you have, use what you know to make friends as Jesus has told us to. Cut people some slack. All right? Show mercy. Love generously. Know that you are a walking testament and give God a good name.